Hello students, welcome to a math lesson converting a fraction into a decimal. Let's do a little bit of review from what we know so far. We know that 1 over 10, when you convert a fraction into a decimal, becomes 1/10, or 0.1. We know that if you have let's say 2 pencils out of 10 pencils, we know that if we wanted to convert that fraction into a decimal, what would that be? You're right, that'd be 2/10, or 0.2. And similarly, if you had 3 over 10, you had 3 things out of 10 things, that would be 0.3, or 3/10, right? Now let's go on to a little bit, one that's slightly bigger. If you've got 10 of the same thing, 8 iPhones out of 10 iPhones, how many iPhones do you have? How would you convert this fraction into a decimal? Again, it's 0.8, or 8/10, all right? And what happens when you have 10 out of 10 things? You have the whole thing, right? You have 1. But if I asked you, to write this whole number into a decimal point, what might you write? How would you convert a whole number into a decimal? Well, you simply add a point and 0. So remember that 1 can also be written as 1.0, or 2 can also be written as 2.0. Right? But what happens when you have a denominator, the number at the bottom, that's 100 instead of 10? Let's convert this fraction into a decimal. If you have 11 of something over 100 of something, right? That makes for 11 100ths, or 0.11, or 0.11, right? Let's do another one. If you have 43 out of 100, or 43 over 100. Notice that there are multiple ways to say fractions as well as decimals. We'll say 43 over 100 here. How would you write this into decimal form? We have 0.43. Notice that we have 2 zeros in 100, and then you have 2 places for the point, the 4, and the 3. And that's how you know if there are 2 spaces to the right of the decimal, you're in the hundredths place value, right? So now, before we continue, notice that it is the 3 in 0.43 that is in the hundredths, and it is the 4 in 0.43 that is in the tenths place, okay? Now let's keep going. What if you had 68 over 100 and you wanted to take this fraction to convert it into a decimal? I'll give you a second to think about what would you write. If you said 68 hundredths, or 0.68, you're correct. So I'm pretty sure that you see the system when you have a denominator of 100, but what happens when that denominator isn't such of a kind, easy to work with number? Like, what about 20? If you had 1 over 20, what happens then? Well, boys and girls, what I want to suggest is that you ask yourself, how would I use multiplication to go from the number I have at the bottom, the denominator, which is 20 here, to 100? How would you go from 20 to 100 using multiplication? You're right. You would multiply by 5, right? So if you had 1 over 20 and you wanted to get something over 100, we're just working with the denominator right now, you'd multiply 20 by 5. 20 times 5, that would give you 100. Now, in order to find the numerator, remember that whatever you do to the bottom, which you multiplied by 5, you also have to do to the top, right? So if you took 20 times 5, you also need to take 1 times 5, which is 5, and that would leave us with 5 over 100, right? Now, you have 5 over 100, but you still haven't answered the question. The question is to take the fraction and turn it into a decimal. So if you have 5 of something over 100, what's the decimal of that? 0.05, or 5 hundredths. Now notice that I have 0.05. I need to write the 0.5 in there because the 5 is in the hundredths place. So this shows me that I have 5 out of 100, not out of 10 or not out of 1,000, but out of 100. Well, let's do another example. What if I gave you 1 out of 25? Last time you had 1 out of 20. This time you'll have 1 out of 25. Remember the question that you ask yourself. You start with the denominator, and you confirm what you have. We have 25, and you're always going to try and get to 100 for this exercise. So how would you go from 25 to 100 using multiplication? Think about it for a moment. To go from 25 to 100, you multiply by 4. So 25 times 4 is 100. So we have our denominator of 100. And remember, whatever you do to the bottom, you have to do to the top. So if we multiply the bottom by 4, you also have to multiply the top by 4. And 1 times 4 is 4. So that leaves us with what, everyone? Right, 4 over 100. Still, however, we have a nicer to work with fraction, but we still need to convert this fraction into a decimal. So if you have 4 of something over 100, you'll have 0 point what? Remember, you only have 4 out of 100. 0.04 or 4 hundredths. Again, notice that there are multiple ways to say the fractions and the decimal. Sort of the most eloquent way of the decimal, it would be here, in this case, would be 4 hundredths. Remember to keep a THS at the end when you say it, hundredths. But you can also say 0.04, but just know that it is 4 hundredths as well. All right, let's do another example. Here the denominator is 50. So again, you ask yourself, start with the denominator, how would you go from what you have, which is 50, to where you want to go, which is 100? Using multiplication, how would you go from 50 to 100? Exactly correct. You multiply by 2, right? And whatever you do to the bottom, you have to do to the top. So if we multiply by 2 on the bottom, we have to multiply by 2 on the top, which would give us what? Right, 2 over 100. Now that we have this nice and easy to work with fraction, 2 over 100, how would we take this fraction and turn it into a decimal? Think about what we've learned so far. 2 over 100. Well, it becomes 2 hundredths, or 0.02. Right? Now, check this one out. 1 over 75. Previously, we've been working with 100, 25, 20, and 50, and all of those numbers went into 100 equally. So I wrote a little question for you right here. Does the same rule of converting, which means changing, the denominator to 100 apply here? Why or why not? I'm going to give you some time to think about that. And as you do, we're going to move on, and we can talk about it later. So here's some practice for you. What I want you to do is pause the video and take this fraction, write the easier fraction with the 100 as the denominator, and then take that fraction and write it as a decimal. So I'm going to give you the answer here in a moment, but before I do, make sure that you pause, that you find an answer. You know, it's not about being right or wrong, it's about, connecting those neurons in our brain, right, that we always talk about, and realizing there's something special that happens when you actually take that pen or pencil to paper, and then you realize, oh yeah, I got it, or hey, I didn't. It's a lot different than when you just watch, right? So make sure you take this time and try it out. So if you have 3 over 25, what goes through my head is I start with the denominator, which is 25, the number at the bottom, and I say, well, I know what I've got 25, and I want to get to 100. In order for me to get from 25 to 100, I know that I need to multiply by 4. And also, whatever I do on the bottom, I have to do to the top. So if I multiply by 4 on the bottom, 4 times 25 equals 100, I also have to multiply by 4 on the top. And 4 times 3 is 12. So you get 12 over 100. And now that you have this 12 over 100, knowing that there should be 2 spaces to the right of the decimal point whenever you write your decimal, what would you get here if you have 12 things out of 100 things? Well, you get 0.12, or said differently, 12 hundredths. All right, let's do another practice. Here we have 11 over 25. Pause the video and give yourself a chance to work with this one. All right, so if you have 11 over 25, again, you begin with the denominator of 25, and you ask yourself what you have, which is 25, and then where you want to go, which is 100, and how do you get there using multiplication? So in order to go from 25 to 100, you multiply by 4. Whatever you do to the bottom, you have to do to the top. 4 times 11 is 44 over 100. We got 44 over 100, right? Now, take this fraction, turn it into a decimal. Give yourself a chance to pause here if you haven't written that down already. 44 over 100 equates to 0.44, or 44 hundredths. Notice that you can put a 0 before the decimal or not, and it's the same thing. But I recommend putting the 0, even though I didn't in this particular case. It just sort of looks nicer, right? Here's another example. Now, before we continue, boys and girls, what do you notice about all of the top numbers, called the numerators, compared to all of the bottom numbers, called the denominators? Well, if you noticed, all of the numerators are smaller than the denominator, and that's because we don't have a whole yet. Notice that if the numerator here is 24, if it was like 26, we would actually have more than 100% of something. We'd actually have more than the whole thing. Okay, so, but here what we do have is 24 over 25. So if you haven't yet, give yourself a chance, pause here, figure an answer out for yourself, and then unpause when you're ready. All right, so if I've got 25, I'm asking myself, how do I go from 25 to 100? Multiply that by 4. Whatever you do to the bottom, you have to do to the top. If I multiplied by 4 on the bottom, I'm going to also multiply by 4 on the top. Now here you sort of run a more challenging problem. You have 24 times 4. Now, boys and girls, we've talked about this before, but what I recommend for you to do in order to keep it mental math, split these numbers up. So instead of trying 24 times 4, why don't you do 20 times 4 and then 4 times 4 and then add those two together? So the way that I think about this is, if I'm doing 20 times 4, I sort of think, well, I've got 2 times 4, which is 4. Sorry, I've got 2 times 4, which is 8, but then there's a 0, so I drop that down. So 20 times 4 is 80. And then we also have 4 times 4, which is 16. And 80 plus 16 is 96. So with the denominator of 100, that gives me 96 over 100. And now, convert this fraction into a decimal. So 96 over 100, what's that going to be? Knowing that there's always 2 spaces to the right of the decimal when you have a denominator of 100, because we're keeping it in the hundredths section. So what would that be? It turns out to be 0.96 or 96 hundredths. All right? Let's do this one right here. We've been doing a lot of work with the decimal being 25. So let's do one that's 50. So again, I begin with the denominator. I ask myself what I have, which is 50, and where I want to go, which is 100. And how would I go from what I have, 50, to 100, where I want to go? It's 50 times what? It's times 2 to get to 100. So whatever I do the bottom, times 2 here, I have to do the top. 7 times 2 is 14, which gives me a fraction of 14 over 100. Convert this into a decimal. That gives you 0.14, or 14 hundredths. Again, it's 14 out of 100 things, all right? Now, by this time, you should be noticing a pattern, noticing a rule. And so what is that rule in order to convert a fraction to a decimal in the hundredths? Boys and girls, what I want you to do is click the link to Padlet that's in today's agenda. And number 1, I want you to write your own rule for converting a fraction into a decimal. Boys and girls, I want you to write this as if you were teaching to a friend. So you can notice on the Padlet on my own that mine's sort of lengthy, and in order to give a good explanation, it helped me to create an example problem. And feel free to do that for yours as well. But I want you to write down your own rule. How do you convert a fraction to a decimal? And then what are some things that you need to keep in mind? Are there certain numbers in the denominator that you won't be able to work with? What about the numerator compared to the denominator? Does one need to be bigger than the other? Right? So write those things down as if you yourself was the teacher and you were going to teach this to one of your friends. Number 2, create a problem for your classmate to solve. So in the Padlet, you'll click the plus button, In the same entry, I want you to write your own rule to convert a fraction to a decimal, and then in that same entry, you create a problem that someone can solve, and then go ahead and solve some of your friends' problem that they created also. Remember, we're doing this on Padlet. All right, hope this helped. Enjoy the converting practice. See you soon.